1978, Washington. A tax bill goes to a vote and nobody in that room understands what they've just done. Your grandfather retired on a promise. You retire on a guess. Somewhere between those two sentences, one paragraph did all the damage. In 1978, a clause almost no one bothered to read slipped into a tax bill, and it quietly rewrote how you will spend the last 20 years of your life. The Revenue Act runs to hundreds of pages, capital gains, tax rates, 100 negotiated compromises stacked one on top of the next. Somewhere in the middle sits a provision numbered 401k. Congress barely glances at it. It is a footnote to a footnote, the kind of technical housekeeping nobody reads aloud and nobody remembers signing. But you live inside it now. The retirement you're promised, the account with your name on it, that number you check late at night and quietly worry about. Is it enough? Will it last? What happens if it isn't? All of it descends from this one accident. Not a plan, not a vision, an accident. So let me ask you something before we go any further. Before this clause, before the account, before Wall Street held your monthly savings and called it a benefit, how did anyone retire at all? And they did retire, millions of them, comfortably, on a promise you'll wish you still had. So what changed? Here is the strange part. This clause wasn't written for you. It was written for something completely different. For a small circle of people who already had more money than they knew what to do with. It should have stayed a favour to the wealthy, buried and forgotten. Instead, it took one man, one benefits consultant, sitting with a client's problem, rereading a single sentence that everyone else in Washington had skipped straight past. What he saw in it turned a footnote into the machine your entire retirement now runs on. And here is my promise to you. By the end of this, you will understand that the safety net your grandparents stood on didn't fail. It didn't collapse. It was quietly replaced, swapped out while you were told it was an upgrade. And the risk of growing old was lifted off the corporation and set gently, deliberately, onto you. But to understand what was taken, you first have to see what was there. A world before the accident, when a company could look you in the eye, promise you a check for the rest of your life, and mean it. Picture a stool with 3 legs. For most of the 20th century, that was retirement in America. The first leg was Social Security, the government's floor beneath your old age. The second was whatever you'd managed to set aside yourself, a personal cushion of savings. And the third, for roughly half of private sector workers in the 1970s, was a pension, an employer's pension. The sturdiest leg of the 3. Understand what that pension actually was, because it is nothing like the account you have today. You worked, you gave a company your decades, and in return, the company made you a promise, a fixed check every month for the rest of your life. Not an account with a balance you watched rise and fall, not a number you managed, a promise. The money would come whether you lived to 70 or 95. Now hold on to the detail almost no one thinks about. Under that promise, the company carried the risk. If the stock market crashed, that was the corporation's problem. If inflation ate away at the dollar, the corporation's problem. If you lived far longer than anyone expected, 30 years past your last day of work, still the corporation's problem. Your job was simply to show up, do the work, and grow old. Someone else did the worrying. Think of the factory worker who clocked out for the last time, knowing the exact figure that would land in his mailbox every month until he died. The phone company lineman, the school teacher. They didn't study markets. They didn't time their retirement to the S&P. They didn't need to. Certainty was the product they'd been sold, and certainty was what they got. That figure didn't shrink in a bad year. It didn't depend on their nerve or their luck or their timing. But certainty is expensive. A pension is a liability that sits on a company's books for decades. A promise made to people who won't collect for years, funded out of profits that shareholders would very much rather keep. Every pensioner is a line item that never stops. You cannot lay off a promise. You cannot renegotiate a check already promised for life. It simply keeps coming due. And somewhere, in boardrooms you and I will never see, people looked at that obligation and quietly wished it gone. So look at the stool one more time. Social Security, personal savings, and the pension. The strongest, most reliable leg of the three. One of them is about to be sawed off. Not by a law that anyone debated, not by a vote you could have watched, by a clause almost no one ever read. And that clause was never meant to touch your retirement at all.
It is November 6, 1978. President Jimmy Carter sits at a desk in Washington and signs the Revenue Act into law. It is a sprawling thing, hundreds of pages about capital gains, tax rates, 100 compromises negotiated in back rooms and forgotten by morning. Buried deep inside it sits that provision numbered 401k. Against the weight of the whole bill, it is a rounding error. Read what the clause actually did, and you'll understand why nobody looked twice. It clarified the tax treatment of something called a cash or deferred arrangement, a coda. That's all. It answered a narrow, technical question. When you set aside part of your pay instead of taking it now, when exactly does the government get to tax it? A dry question. But look at who it was written for. This was, in the main, about executives. A highly paid manager takes a fat cash bonus or a share of the company's profits, and he'd rather not hand a chunk of it to the IRS this year in his highest earning years. The clause let him defer it, take the money later, pay the tax later. It was a tidy little favour for people who already had more income than they knew what to do with. The congressman most often tied to the provision is Barber Conable, a Republican from upstate New York. And here is the scale of the attention it received: almost none. It wasn't a headline, it wasn't a policy anyone campaigned on, it wasn't debated on the floor as a landmark of anything. It was housekeeping, a small technical fix slotted into a giant bill, waved through. Sit with the irony, because the entire story turns on it. Not one person in that capital believed they were building a national retirement system. Nobody stood up to announce the end of the pension. They thought they were tidying the tax code for the comfortable few. And so the single most consequential retirement law in modern American history passed into being as a footnote, unread,
unremarked, unmourned. But the words were on the page now. That's the thing about law. It doesn't much care what its authors meant. It only says what it says. And this sentence said more than the men who wrote it ever realized. Far more. If only someone were to sit down and read it closely, line by line, and ask what it truly permitted. For 2 years, no one did. The clause sat there in the code, dormant, waiting. A loaded sentence nobody had noticed was loaded. And then someone did. It is 1980. In a small benefits consulting office in Pennsylvania, a man named Ted Benner is bent over a problem that has nothing to do with changing history. He is trying to design a better retirement plan. The story goes, originally for a bank that was his client. And somewhere in that work, he does the one thing no one in Washington bothered to do. He reads Section 401k, slowly, word by word. Everyone else had seen a footnote about executives. Benner sees something else. The wording, he realizes, never actually says this is only for the men at the top. It talks about employees deferring pay. It doesn't say which employees. Read plainly, read literally, the same sentence written to let a manager delay the tax on a bonus could let an ordinary worker, the clerk, the machinist, the person who never sees a bonus in their life, set aside part of their own salary before the tax ever touches it, pre-tax, into an account with their name on it. That alone would have been remarkable. But Benner sees the second half, the part that makes the whole thing catch fire. The employer could match it. Put in $1 and the company adds 50 cents, or $1 of its own. On paper, it looks like free money. A tax break and a bonus wrapped into one thing offered to everyone. Now, be careful here, because this is where the accident becomes a decision. Nothing in the law commanded this. This was an interpretation. Benner took a narrow provision meant to tidy up how the well-off deferred their bonuses, and he read it wide open, into a savings machine for the entire American workforce. It was not what the drafters had in mind. It was, arguably, the opposite of what they had in mind. But the words on the page didn't forbid it. And words on a page are all the tax code is. So, in 1981, Benner does the bold thing. He doesn't just write a memo and float the idea. He builds it. He sets up the first real 401k plan at his own firm, the Johnson Companies. He stands on his own reading. He bets his own workplace on a sentence he interpreted differently than the men who wrote it. And then comes the moment that turns a clever reading into the law of the land. That same year, the IRS issues proposed regulations that effectively accept the interpretation. The government looks at what Benner did, and instead of shutting it down, it blesses it. The loophole is now functionally official. What began as one consultant squinting at a footnote becomes a legitimate, sanctioned way to build a retirement plan in America. And here is the thing you have to hold on to, because it matters later. Ted Benner was not a villain. He believed, genuinely, that he had found workers a gift, a benefit the tax code had accidentally left lying on the table, and he was simply handing it to them. In his own mind, this was a good deed. Remember that, because the man's view of his own creation is going to change. So the 401k sounds like a win for the ordinary worker. A tax break, an employer match, an account of your own. Where is the unease? Here it is. This account was never meant to replace anything. It was supposed to sit quietly beside your pension, a little something extra on top of the promise. So how did a footnote end up eating the whole meal? For that, you have to look across the table at what the corporations had wanted gone for years. Because the moment this new account existed, the people who signed your paycheck saw something Ted Benner didn't. Not a supplement to the pension, a way to be rid of it entirely. They saw it fast. Through the 1980s, what began as one consultant's clever reading became a stampede. One company opened a 401k, then another, then 100 more. By the middle of the decade, it wasn't a novelty, it was a movement. And almost no one asked what it was quietly replacing. Here is what the men in the boardrooms understood that the workers signing up did not. A 401k let a company stop promising a check for life and start offering an account instead. The difference sounds small. It is everything. A pension is a debt, a lifetime obligation sitting on the books, owed to people who haven't even retired yet. An account is a transaction. You put money in, the company adds a little, and the relationship ends there. No promise, no liability. No decades of risk stretching out into a future no executive can see. And so the strongest leg of the three-legged stool, the pension, the one your grandparents stood on without a second thought, was quietly sawed off. There was no vote, there was no headline. Companies simply froze their pension plans, closed them to new hires, and let them fade. No funeral, just a memo. Now here is the part that should make you sit up. Remember who used to carry the risk. Under a pension, if the market crashed, that was the company's problem. If you lived to 95, their problem. If inflation gnawed at the value of your check, still their problem. Under a 401k, every one of those risks is yours. If the market collapses the year you plan to retire, your problem. If you outlive your savings, your problem. If you were never taught how to invest, and most people never were, that too is now your problem. In one quiet shift, the risk of growing old moved off the corporate balance sheet and onto your kitchen table. Remember that generous-sounding employer match? It was real. But look at it clearly. A match was almost always far cheaper than funding a pension that would pay out for 30 years after you stopped working. Companies didn't embrace the 401k because they'd found a way to be kind. They embraced it because it was an escape hatch, a legal exit from a burden they had wanted gone for decades. And here is the loop finally closing. That deferral language, written to help executives keep a little more of their bonuses, ended up serving the corporation's oldest wish, to be free of the promise entirely. Somebody won. Corporations shed billions in open-ended obligations. And Wall Street, the mutual fund industry, firms like Fidelity and Vanguard, received something almost too good to be true. A river of money deposited automatically out of tens of millions of paychecks every single month, whether markets rose or fell, year after year, forever. And somebody was left exposed. The worker who couldn't spare enough to save, the one who invested badly, the one who panicked and sold at the bottom, the one who cashed out early and swallowed the penalty. The system quietly rewards the disciplined and the already comfortable, and just as quietly punishes everyone who slips. In a single decade, with no national debate, America had done something extraordinary. It had turned retirement from a promise the company kept into a project the worker managed alone. Which leaves one question, the very question the man who started all this would spend the rest of his life turning over. If it was such a good deal, why did so many Americans reach the end of their working lives with so little? Look at where it left us. Traditional pensions have all but vanished from the private sector. The 401k and plans like it became the default, the thing most workers now retire on, or fail to. A large share of Americans reach their 60s with little or no retirement savings at all. The median 401k balance is modest, not a fortune, not a cushion for 30 years of old age. A number far below what a secure retirement actually costs. This is the reckoning. The certainty a pension once guaranteed, the check that arrived every month until you died, whether markets rose or fell, is gone. In its place sits a number you're told to manage yourself, in a system almost no one was ever trained to navigate. You were handed the controls of a machine and never given the manual. And the man who built it lived long enough to see what it became. Ted Benner, the father of the 401k, spent his later years turning it over in his mind. He had believed he was handing ordinary workers a gift the tax code accidentally offered them, but he watched it grow into something larger and colder than he intended, a creation that outran its creator. In time, he came to question the monster the footnote became. So return to the question we started with. Before the 401k, before the account with your name on it, how did anyone retire at all? On the pension leg of the three-legged stool, an employer's promise of a check for life. That is the leg that got sawed off, not by a vote, not by a debate, not by anything you or your parents were ever asked to approve. By an accident of tax law almost no one bothered to read. Here is the part that should stay with you. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as the accident allowed. The risk you now carry, the risk of markets, of living too long, of choosing wrong, was never something you agreed to take on. It was quietly moved onto your shoulders while it was dressed up as a gift. So the next time you open that account and check the balance, remember where it came from. It exists because a clause meant for executives was reread by one man in 1980, and the safety net your grandparents stood on was swapped for a rope you're told to climb alone. The ledger exists to show you the machinery behind the money you're told not to question. If this changed the way you see your own paycheck, subscribe, because the next accident is already being written into law somewhere. And when it is, we'll be here to read the clause no one else did.